and I can see that the audience numbers are slowly filling up. So I'm going to very quickly start off by introducing myself. My name is Latina, and I'm going to be the host for this Meet the Researchers series of sessions. This morning we have a very packed session. We have 6 speakers and 6 presentations. Each presentation will last for 10 minutes, and we encourage the audience members to ask questions in the chat, especially if we don't have enough time to ask questions directly to speakers in the end of the session. So first up is Louis Smith talking about overcoming barriers to social and hierarchical places through the design of immersive composition and performance. So Louis, if you'd like to join us on stage and share your presentation, we'll be very interested to hear what you've got to say.
So hopefully you can see and hear me. I'll just double check in the minute. Yes, and you can hear me. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So sorry, I'm trying to find my slides again. Yeah, so I'm a researcher at Ulster University. I'm a musician. I've been working professionally for about almost 30 years. And the background to my research, which I'm trying to get through very quickly, is basically based on the social model of disability, which defines disability as a social creation. Tom Shakespeare actually goes on to say that impairment is personal and private. And one of the key lines from the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, Paul Hunt, Victor Finkelstein as well, he said this line, he quoted this line, that disabled people should, with the advice and help of others, assume control. And this has been very important throughout my PhD research, that the stakeholders in my research assume control. And we've basically been saying that I'm designing me out of a job. So in the literature, accessible digital musical interfaces have been almost exclusively in performance. You can find one, perhaps, that is for music composition, but it hasn't been maintained. It basically doesn't exist anymore. So it's been argued that disability is socio-spatially constructed. People with disabilities are not only excluded from social spaces, they're often segregated within those spaces. Does your theatre cater for disabled people? Yes, we have a whole back row for them. You know, that's the segregation. So I've been really looking at a way of trying to change that, that my colleagues with disabilities assume the roles that I can rapidly move around. I'm a composer, I'm a performer, I conduct and lead my own compositions. So these are hierarchical places that musicians normally inhabit. So I want to create software that made sure that my colleagues could do the same. And actually they do. So just to quickly, you can see the videos on the left. It's actually a system of applications. There's Compose with Feel, working title, which is a DAW-like application. So for non-musicians, that's a digital audio workstation. It's not strictly a DAW because it really just composes with Feel VR. And I created that using C++ and the Juice framework. Then we have with Feel VR, where performances are done over a network. It's an ensemble application. So musicians create network rooms, but the physical spaces themselves are actually dictated by the composer. And for both these applications, I had to create my own audio plugin in C++. So the idea was to have consistency in auditioning and in performance. So when a composer is working through their composition, they can hear what it might sound like when they eventually go into VR and conduct or perform their music. So to do this, I use participatory design and some embodied metaphors, and I'll get into that now. So participatory design, if you don't know, involves different non-designers in various co-design activities throughout the design process. So from day one to day end, the participants have been involved in the design of the software. And participatory design usually arises because of political reasons, social reasons, the imbalance of power and knowledge. But there can also be that, well, usually is, that knowledge imbalance between researcher and participants. Muller and Druin, it's Michael Muller and Alison Druin, suggests exploring hybrid or third spaces. So it's this Venn diagram, if you want, of skills or communication, where you can negotiate. So the participants in this project, possibly through discrimination in the education system, have never been trained in music. So as I said before, almost 30 years as a musician, I have a certain musical language. Normally where you see that knowledge imbalance is in the technical language used to create computer systems, but for us it was in the musical language. So we looked to try and find a third space where myself and the participants could cohabit, and we looked at embodied cognition for that, because we were talking about VR. It's about exploring space in our bodies. So just to give you a general idea of what that might be, it's pitch height, so high notes and low notes. You can see me move my arms probably, to say high notes and low notes. Audio and sound doesn't have height, and this is something we think about with our bodies. There's the moving music metaphor. So you're all very aware of your MP3 players you drag across. So music and time are conceptualized through space. And timbre is often described as either tactile or visual. So rough and sound, or smooth sounding, or light and dark as well. So this actually brought about some nice design artifacts where we could compose and perform using the morphology of 3D objects. So this is one of the instruments. The composer actually dictates what this instrument looks like. When you move across this object, you scan through or you scrub through the audio sample. Where the texture is smooth, the audio plugin that I created will make the sound smooth. Where the texture is rough, it will make it rough. And we support that with haptic feedback as well. And where there are bumps, there are high notes, where there are dips, there are low notes. So the whole morphology of the object becomes our musical language, and we could design with this. So this ended up becoming compositional elements. Then we could design with these objects, with this material, and we, the shape of the object dictates the pitch variation, the material, the timbral modulation. And in conducting, like I said, we're trying to fill all these roles: composer, conductor, performer. So by drawing in space, we can send gestures to a performer and tell him how we might want them to perform. So another way we had to fill all these roles was obviously to consider all the varied minds and bodies of the participants. And you might hear something here. I might pause this because it'll be a bit loud. So we had to look at multimodal interaction. The video that is not playing at the minute is actually using eye gaze. It became very clear that even though my PhD was around working with VR, that actually we had to consider people couldn't use VR. So it equally works without VR, and it can use eye gaze. And to keep it interactive, even when you move your head, the screen, the camera will move, and so on.
1 minute, Lewis. You have 1 minute.
Getting there, yeah, thank you. So just to give you an idea of the multimodal interactions, we have mouse interaction, 2D eye gaze, VR head gaze, VR controller, and hands and leap motion, and all these roles have been filled. One other thing I'll get to quickly was the idea of graduate decision making. So you might notice that there were icons in the composition application. The reason they're there is so that you, I'm rushing myself here, was to categorize sounds. So we graduate and simplify decision making. The VR application will look at the composition, see if someone actually made a decision on objects and material. If they don't, they'll use aleatory. For non-musicians, aleatory literally means throw of a dice. John Cage was very famous for working in this way. And usability was a big factor. So the system usability scale, which we just recently did, we scored 82 on that, which is thankfully well above average. So summarize, I am rushing a wee bit, sorry. We believe we've created an immersive creation and performance system that allows musicians to inhabit multiple places within hierarchical structures of music making. We've done it by finding a hybrid space and a shared musical language, and that brought about some very unique design artifacts. By considering the diverse minds and bodies of those participants and incorporating multimodal interaction and the graduate decision making, which unfortunately I've rushed through, it was kind of important. And all of that, the usability was actually supported by thinking musically, thinking about contemporary compositional practices. And like I said, we've had a very strong focus on usability. And that is me. There's loads of reference if anybody needs the slides, and that's me.
Okay, thank you very much, Lewis. Your presentation is promptly followed by Constantin Popp's presentation on Planet Exarilla. I'm really sorry if I'm butchering this title, Constantin. Please tell us more about your project.
Wait, hello. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Yes, hello. So welcome to the presentation, Planet Exarilla, Crafting Navigo's Narrative Audio-Driven Spaces for VR. So I will not show any sound examples. You can find them instead in the poster's companion video hosted on the Beyond's webpage or via the QR code on the right. You can find more information about the project in general via the QR code on the left. Advancements in 3D audio for headset-based immersive technologies provide new toolkits for sound designers to create narrative, audio-driven spaces for the audience to explore in VR. As these toolkits and VR experiences generally present their own conceptual and technological constraints, the sound designer needs to develop new methodologies in creating spaces, sound, and music to adapt to the changed situation. The screenshot shows such a situation in which the user, here indicated by the letter A, has complete control over the scene's camera, position, and angle, the time they spend at any given location, and the ability to interact with the virtual objects. Rooted in practice-led research and based on recommendations suggested by Google Inc., the presentation discusses some of the issues and solutions arising from employing Google Resonance Audio and FMOD in the development of a user-navigable experience called Planet Exarilla. In Planet Exarilla, the user wanders through soundscapes and interacts with virtual sound installations as seen in the screenshot. The sound installations, here represented as different types of machinery, are either interactive, A and B, or non-interactive, C, and form part of the soundscape, externalizing narration into visualized sound objects. Additional sound objects populate the soundscape further to define its spatial characteristics and narrative connotation. The sound installations and soundscapes both invite the user to listen and experiment, aiming to excite curiosity and oral satisfaction, as well as telling the story via various sensorial and behavioral representations. Discussing loss, hope, and persistence, the story focuses on two scientists trying to save their civilization prior and after a devastating meteor impact. The authors tested several strategies to craft the environments, among them using the blending of audio formats, room simulation, sound field recordings, and recreation of recorded soundscapes. Each of these strategies requires specific adjustments to be compatible with the experience's concept and technology. Stereo recordings, useful for the simulation of volumetric sounds and space effects, can be converted into several time-aligned point sources, but are convincing only from specific listening angles. The screenshot highlights the effect of the listening angles for the listener. User A, positioned in the sweet spot, hears the stereo sound image as intended, here shown as a plane with birds. The apparent soft width shrinks for user B, however, and collapses completely for user C. The authors therefore recommend multiple point sources stemming from the randomized, decorrelated playback of a single sound to avoid these issues. That way, each point source becomes sonically related and generates a valid sound image, even when heard from an unflattering angle. Due to a lack of distance attenuation and spatial resolution, the shoebox-type room simulation obfuscates sound localization, especially in larger spaces. The resulting reverb tails need to be attenuated to improve localization. Google Resonance Audio offers several options to achieve attenuation, reducing the overall gain, reflectivity, or decay time of the reverb, adjusting the reflection properties of each wall, or excluding small sounds from reverberation prove successful. Marking at least one surface as acoustically transparent in a large space, even when not actually visually transparent, improves clarity tremendously and avoids low-frequency buildup. The reverb implementation simulates only the space containing the viewer's perspective, in the screenshot labeled with Room A. This causes unreverberated sounds from adjacent spaces to bleed into the current space, here labeled with C. Adding transitional, largely overlapping, non-visual spaces between spaces, and adjusting the placement, radiation pattern, and playback state of border sounds helps to mitigate this issue. The transition can be further eased through an additional nondescript sound field background sound, potentially masking a lack of sounds or reverb tails. By default, sound field playback of ambisonic recordings conflict with the perception of a navigable space as they are centered at the listener's position. This means that sound objects contained in the sound field cannot be approached, and their lack of response to position and movement would need to be disguised. Adding blur and removing clearly localized sounds from the recording, as well as supplementing the recording with similar recognizable sounds as point sources, helps to mitigate this issue. Distance attenuation can be added manually via automating F-mod's distance parameter, creating the option to crossfade between related ambisonics recordings. The screenshot illustrates this strategy. Here, most of the platforms have their own ambisonic sound field, letter A through F. Each sound field, however, relates to the others through either stemming from the same field recording transformed slightly differently, or through using a recording with a slightly different perspective of the same place. The screenshot also shows small cubes, which represent the point sources augmenting the sound fields, exemplary labeled 1 through 4. Also, the sound designers reduced the size of the platforms to further disguise the lack of movement response of the sound fields. The creative, story-driven reconstruction of field recordings proved advantages in finding suitable sound combinations to craft credible, natural-sounding spaces, but necessitated complex sound editing, parameterization, and recreation of their behaviors in Unity. This process, along with strategies of simplification and abstraction of field recordings as described in Popp, offered deep control over the makeup and appearance of the resulting soundscape. For example, the authors analyzed a field recording of water drops falling onto a concrete floor of a large outdoor gate of a city. They reimagined its sound combination in an area of the experience using similar, dry, and isolated sounds. The screenshot here presents the result visually. Stylized white raindrops labeled A and various rotor blades labeled B. The author separated each impact of water drops of a recording, sorted into a sorted collection of sounds, assigned them to the collision velocity of an object falling in Unity, and designed an algorithm which spawns and recycles each falling object. The authors then translated the hum of the city to various hums emitted by rotor blades, with their sound sourced from transformed recordings of a dehumidifier. Ultimately, Google Resonance Audio, in combination with F-Mode, becomes a powerful toolkit in the creation of immersive, navigable, audio-driven spaces if the sound designer utilizes its opportunities and limitations effectively. The toolkit promises comparably high-quality 3D audio, while also providing the means to address possible shortcomings of its implementation, as seen in the author's use of reverb, sound with recordings, and specialized mono sounds. These solutions in creating spaces can be applied on various platforms too, thanks to the platform-agnostic nature of the toolkit. Further research could extend the toolkit's constraints, such as adding distance attenuation for reverberated sounds, concurrent room simulation, and for space and space effects and volumetric sound effects.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Constantin. That was really great. Your slides were very meta. I loved them. Thank you very much for your presentation. Please note your questions to Constantin about his project in the chat. His presentation is immediately followed by Tessa Ratuszynska and her talk on Club XXY. I'm really interested to hear more about this project and especially about the way it's titled. So if Tessa Ratuszynska can please join us on stage.
Okay, hello. My name is Tessa. I'm completing a practice-based PhD at the University of the West of Scotland. And also last year, I was a New Talent Fellow on the Bristol and Bath Creative Cluster Expanded Performance Pathfinder. My PhD is concerned with exploring the transformative potential of virtual reality nonfiction, and I'm exploring VR's ability to embody radical and queer perspectives. The Expanded Performance Pathfinder looked at how new technology interventions expand ideas of audience and liveness, and I was looking at multi-user VR as sites of performance and coming together. And so this project, Club XXY, is the output of that funded research. The image I have here on screen is a Vitruvian Man-type architectural scaling model that I've adapted to be wearing a VR headset. And I'm using this to communicate how white, male, ableist and Western-centric a lot of VR design has been, from the headsets to the documentary content. Oh, there we go. So although social virtuality has never really taken off in the way it was predicted to, Mark Zuckerberg is obviously extremely dedicated to the cause of at-home VR use. And this is precisely to fulfill Facebook's prophecy that the future of social media interaction will happen inside virtual reality. And maybe he has good reason, because as the pandemic has indicated, there are times when face-to-face contact with others just isn't going to be possible, whether that's the ongoing effects of COVID or imminent ecological collapse. There is a need for online spaces where people can be together. The drastic uptake of apps like Zoom across lockdown illustrated that text, email, and social media-based interactions weren't enough to sustain most of us at this time, and that more embodied mediums are needed. And this is illustrated here by a screenshot from Queer House Party, which is an accessible, radical DIY Zoom party. A quick Google of Zoom and video calls in COVID brings up many articles about the long-term psychological effects of not experiencing embodied presence of others and the Zoom fatigue issues created by video lag. So the premise of social VR, which is an embodied medium where multiple users can be together inside three-dimensional space, their bodies represented in real time, seems an increasingly credible one. And obviously they do already exist, and they did spawn up further across the pandemic. So Facebook released its new app Horizon, and festivals like Glastonbury recreated events inside multi-user VR platforms. So multi-user VR from its inception has been widely criticized for being sexist, exclusionary, and ultimately violent. And the platforms themselves unequipped to safeguard marginalized bodies. And this is important because of the ability to feel ownership and connection with your virtual body. A sexual or violent assault in VR can have long-lasting emotional impact to the user. It's been illustrated that bias and prejudice can be enhanced in virtual reality the Proteus effect, where users who deem their avatar more attractive are more gregarious in social VR. Avatars with taller, those embodied in taller avatars become more aggressive, and a troubling study with participants, both black and white, scoring higher on an implicit racial bias test after a VR experience embodying a black body in a job interview scenario. And this is thought to be because the scenario itself triggered negative stereotypes about black people and work. So clearly, the venues, avatar presentation, game mechanics, and culture of multi-user VR spaces can have visceral consequences for users. Even spaces like Second Life, which are predicated on self-expression and departure from normative presentation restrictions, are shown in Alicia Kurtz's paper to be structurally biased towards sexed and through this gendered bodies, and non-human and ungendered bodies are built on top of gendered origins, and through this all avatars interactions in the space remain gendered. But it is possible for VR embodiment to be far more expansive, and users have been shown to be comfortable operating avatars which wildly depart from normative human form, and I'm thinking here of Jaron Lanier's homuncular flexibility. Legacy Russell beautifully outlines the potential of virtual embodiment to expand and move beyond restrictive normative ideals, which are the ideals by which bodies are othered and minoritized in glitch feminism. So she describes non-performance of the normative as glitch, and this glitch is a form of refusal. So I'm quoting her: "All technology reflects the society that produces it, including its power structures and prejudices. Glitch bodies are not considered in the process of programming new technologies. However, through the digital, we dare to make new worlds and dare to modify our own. Glitch feminism demands an occupation of the digital as a means of world building. And revolutionary change manifests through a reconsideration of the spatial, in negotiation with spatial limitations and identification of how to overturn, dissolve, and break through these boundaries. Usurp the body, become your avatar, be the glitch." So to contextualize this project a bit further, it was made in the global pandemic with the closure of many community, particularly queer and minoritized community spaces, and the unparalleled movement of the social, political, working and resting facets of life into the digital sphere. This was also a year that's seen unprecedented protest against state violence and systemic racial oppression, and has also seen a growing cultural awareness of structural and material inequality, and an interest in abolitionist and activist tactics and alternative future visions. So social VR could evidently benefit from, but also be a site to expand upon and virtually realize these alternate futures. So the project itself, Club XXY, to enter the project, you have to agree to some terms, the most important of which I'm going to read out, which is that although you may enter any of these venues, please be considerate that the space inside might not be built for you or around your comfort. And although you may learn from these spaces function to serve their communities and not to educate those outside of them. So it's important that the way the project was made reflects the accessible and equitable ambitions of the spaces represented within it. So an open call out for artists focused not on artists with VR or 3D skills, but those whose politics, personal identity, and work aesthetic made them a fit for the spaces they were going to represent. All freelance contributors were paid, and the call out was explicit about the origins of the funding, including my fee. And contributors were actively encouraged to consider if their payment was sufficient for their input, and the process aimed at being as transparent and non-hierarchical as possible. Contributing interviews ranged from Leopold Lambert, who's the editor-in-chief of the Funambulist magazine, Daniela Braithwaite-Shirley, who's an artist who uses games design to archive Black trans experience, and contributing space and events makers had their nights recreated inside the virtual room environment by selected artists, and this included Aisha Mirza's Misery Party, which is a harm reduction collective, and a sober club night centering healing for queer, trans, non-binary, Black, and people of color. So this is an example of a matchup between a queer collage artist, JP Murphy, and the DIY queer art night in Bristol called Thorny. In order to accommodate artists who had little to no coding or VR experience, collaborating design studio Biome Collective created this box template that artists could work with, and a live platform where artists could drag their work in progress template and see it represented three-dimensionally. The spaces were also created to be as accessible as possible, with the option to forego the background sound, which you might be able to hear lightly, the ambient sound. And there was closed captioning in every space and interview. And my conclusions, which I'll marry with the next steps here, is although it was cost effective and it lowered a barrier to access to use the box template, obviously there are philosophical ramifications to boxing in the artists' representations of the spaces. And there were real financial limitations that meant that avatars couldn't be explored in this version of the experience, and obviously they're quite important to the project. It was complicated to navigate my positionality as the interviewer and the impact that would have on spaces that centered Black and people of color, such as Misery Party, for example, and the vision of that space being communicated more horizontally to the contributing artist. So this feels more of an intervention at the beginning and pulling these ideas into VR rather than a conclusion. The project still needs to be showcased, and there's a workshop plan for the future that would allow artists, developers and contributors to work together without having to go through my interview. And there's an accessible Instagram version of all the interviews being launched soon. And that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tessa, about this presentation, about how some of the social discourses that permeate our physical world seem to be translating into the virtual reality as well now. So perhaps Mark Zuckerberg's dream is really coming to life. So Tessa's presentation is immediately followed by David Cotter, who's going to talk to us about the creative musical collaboration in the 21st century. David, I believe the stage is yours, so I'll just disappear.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Latina. Just share my slides. Hopefully you can all see that okay. I apologize if you hear weird noises from my laptop, but it's just having one of those days. And there it starts. So I'm going to squeeze into these next 10 minutes a quick presentation about creative musical collaboration in the 21st century and just how varied that can be now. Speaking in 2014, Margaret Barrett pointed out that collaborations may occur on a number of levels and degrees of separation, including those of place, time, and expertise. And as we've all probably seen over the last 18 months, this definition has really been pushed to its limit. Since early 2020, the number of ensembles who have been collaborating, performing together online has really proliferated, with a huge array of ensembles of all shapes and sizes using digital technologies to connect themselves across vast physical and temporal distances. A few examples here. There was the large virtual guitar orchestra, which I was lucky enough to perform in, which brought together 200 guitarists from 40 countries. There are a number of medium-sized ensembles, and I also performed a number of small duos and trios, etc. So a huge breadth that I engaged with, but all of these ensembles was underpinned by the same kind of model, whereby musicians would be pre-recording their parts, sending them to a third party who would compile them and then package that into some kind of audio-visual product, which, you know, was great in some respects, but obviously you lose that sense of liveness, you lose that sense of audience, the sense of the comfort and discomfortness of presentness, you lose some form of vulnerability, you lose some risk and uncertainty. All of these things you'd think you'd want to lose, but in fact they're kind of very, very important in terms of achieving creative, exciting musical performance. So why do people stitch these things together? Well, it's because of latency. It's because of the lag that we all experience, and we can try and minimize it, but we can never get rid of it. So in that respect, nothing will be the same as performing together. So this is the backdrop of what's going on, and Dr. Mark Estebero, a friend of mine who I'd known since 2016, and we'd met a number of times and explained our interests, he got in touch about a project, any project. And this just showed how the lockdowns forced us online, but also showed that something good could come out of this. And it also forced us to address this issue of latency. So we started with a very limited brief, which was, we're going to embrace this thing. We're not going to fight against it. We're going to create a piece for guitar, 2 guitars and electronics, where we explore latency. And the idea was that through that, we might be able to learn some more about how performers collaborate in this virtual domain, all the time by developing an environment which was relatively free from paraphernalia, ideal switches and leads and things which we would have to engage with during performance. Mark, expert coder, came up with a Super Collider patch. Super Collider is a text-based coding system. And the idea was that the computer would be receiving the music that we sent to it. It would be mediating the musical expressive parameters in terms of pitch, etc., and then sending it back to us and to our collaborators. So although there are only 2 guitarists, but real people, so to speak, there are actually going to be 2 real guitarists and 2 virtual guitarists, all collaborating in this kind of virtual space. Compositionally, we had to come up with our musical material in a way that would work well with the computers. So that meant composing a lot of short gestures, which could be fed into the machine, and something meaningful could be done with them. Other questions arose, such as, how are we going to present this kind of musical material? We've got code, this musical material, and we've got to put it together in some kind of meaningful aesthetic way. We were looking at the visual scores that really influenced us by composers such as Stockhausen, Ferniholt, etc., George Crumb. And it was at this time that it was dawning on us that everything we were doing was a manifestation of the balance between order and chaos. Where we had shared musical interests, we had different kind of levels of expertise. He was an expert coder, I was and still am a complete novice. Technology was aiding our collaboration in the virtual domain, but we still lacked the tools we would have ideally liked. I mean, this is our reliance on these softwares, for example. We spent 1,200 minutes on Zoom in the space of a month. So we settled on this famous yin-yang symbol as a representation of this balance between order and chaos, and we used that for the score. So this score here measures 1 meter by 1 meter, so it's a big thing. My gestures that I composed on the right, his on the left. And the idea is that as a performer, you take a gesture, you play it, you improvise around it, you feed it to the computer, and then you respond to what both your collaborator's doing and with what the computer's doing. You return to these low guitaristic E motifs every 60 seconds, and it will move the patch on. It'll move the AI on to the next stage. Obviously, for any kind of score which is involving, this amount of technology, etc., you need developed performance directions. So that is what we provided, and we thought it was important to make the electronic parts available from our respective websites. A lot of people are doing amazing work, creating new platforms for musical expression and composition and performance, and we don't want those being lost as soon as the lockdowns end. We want some long-term good to come of this. For the technical side of things, it's become increasingly easy to mic up certain instruments, and this is what was happening. Our guitars would be going through audio interfaces, going into Super Collider, and then being sent via OBS through Sonobus, high quality audio streaming, to our collaborator, who would be 300 miles away. And although we developed a platform where engagement with the systems themselves, we didn't need to touch things so much during the performance, it was still really draining. So online performance is still really tiring, in that you've got to keep one eye on your instrument, one eye on the video recorder. If you're using code, one eye on the code, one eye on your co-performer, maybe that's Zoom, maybe that's Hopin, one eye on the score, one eye on your kit. So it's very tiring. I'll just play a brief 30 seconds clip from this video. At times in the piece, the supercollider patch, the online, let's say, guitarists would be giving us small gestures back, brittle landscapes. At other times, it would completely swamp us and provide this kind of more lush soundscape on which we could improvise. I'll keep moving on because I'm conscious of time, but the whole thing can be viewed on YouTube. And we learned a lot from this, but one of the main things we learned was that we learned about the omnidirectional feedback loops that occur between performers, both in the real world and both in the virtual domain. We're constantly relying on our co-performers in terms of sonic stimuli, visual stimuli. We're relying on their expressions, all of these kind of things. And one big thing in the literature is that moments of meaningful creativity are usually predicated on those instances where two musicians are looking at each other when there's heightened eye contact. But we found this wasn't the case. A lot of the time when we were looking at each other, that was just to ensure that this project was working. Other times when we had our eyes closed, we were actually more closely attuned to what our co-performers and what the online performers were doing. So that was really interesting. 3 brief closing remarks. We found over the last year that the musical pluralism of 21st century guitar practice has really brought guitarists to the vanguard of this kind of remote collaborative and performative endeavors. It's much easier to jack up, amp up some instruments such as guitars and keyboards than it is, let's say, oboes and clarinets or even violins, although great strides are being made in those areas. We found that virtual collaboration and musical collaboration more generally can be conceived in terms of a balance between order and chaos, and that this should be researched even further because we find it to be so important. And we found that the innovative nature of latent of this kind of online virtual model really allowed us to interrogate the creative and collaborative processes that occur between musicians collaborating in the 21st century. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was really interesting. You're basically talking about coding music, almost. Thank you very much for your presentation. Immediately following your presentation, we are joined by Georgios Varustos, presenting his project Sounding Belfast during COVID-19. So sort of keeping the musical and the sound and the oral cultures theme going. So Georgios, if we can see you on the screen. Yes, fantastic. And then David and I will leave. Yes, we can hear you.
So hello everyone, my name is Georgios Varutsos. I'm a PhD student at the Sonic Arts Research Center here at Queen's University Belfast. And today I'll be talking about some research I've been doing throughout my PhD, which is Sounding Belfast. So this is a paper discussion about 2 of the projects I've already completed. The overall research I've been doing is documenting COVID since the start of March 2020. Originally, from my master's, which I completed here, which was based on the piece walls, I want to use the form of audio in documenting place, story, and person. Since my PhD started actually in February 2020, a lot of things had changed at that time. So in March 2020, when COVID happened, it was a little confusing to see if I was going to continue my research. And I started actually this project as a passive project in order to document and kind of share the story of what Belfast was going through at the time. So I started to record back in a few days after the first lockdown, which happened on March 23rd. And what I was doing was using the Visit Belfast tourist map as a guideline for sound markers or places that tourists and locals would be aware of. And I continued this project throughout the exit strategies in the summer of 2020. And then when the lockdown 2 returned in October, I continued these locations and kind of themes of what was happening. Now, the format of it was used with the stay-at-home orders, so I was using it as a guideline in order to record my projects or to record the places. And now I've distributed this across my own website, but as well as on archives and digital sound maps. The overall scope of my research was trying to figure out on-site and off-site experiences, and this will touch on immersive experiences, so using like ambisonics or binaural, and then the understanding of how to use sound on virtual platforms so others can access the information that was happening here. When looking into my research, I'm considering the documentation of sound and experiences. So not only the physical presence of sound, but the perspective of what we're listening to and what that means to ourselves. Now, during COVID, I didn't have the opportunity of studying other people. So I had to switch my methodology in order to study the self. So I was using autohermeneutics to understand my perspective of sound and the experiences I was going through at that time. And now the documentation of all this sound, I was using the material to create an understanding of what was happening and the changes throughout all of the lockdowns and the spaces themselves. When I'm talking about the stay-at-home orders, stay-at-home rules, I'm using that as a guideline so I could have something similar across the projects. And what that means is when COVID first came out, there were rules of how we could be outdoors, and one of them was for your exercise. So I used my sound walking experiences as a guideline to record 5 minutes of audio in each of these kind of marks or places and rendered them down to 2-minute audio listening experiences. On one hand, it was whatever was usable in my 5-minute recordings, and as well because I have so many spaces for people to actually listen to them. So in the first instance of the lockdown 1, they were separate recordings just because I did some in March and then followed them in July and August. Whereas in lockdown 2 that happened in October, I had the opportunity to record right before the lockdown, so on October 15th. October 16th was the lockdown, and then deep lockdown was on part of it on October 21st. Again, I was using the tourist map to act as a guideline for the first lockdown, but then the theme of the second lockdown, it was targeted towards hospitality and education. So I was going to these sectors in Belfast to understand what was happening with restaurants, schools such as Queen's, and other parts that would have maybe more tourists in terms of going out. There were a lot of limitations for this study. So for the lockdown 1, I didn't have the opportunity to record prior to the lockdowns. So I don't have this material that of pre-lockdown what Belfast sounded like. I had the opportunity to record the lockdown 2, so there's a bit of understanding of what was happening between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2. So when the exit strategies and people were going back outdoors or using the spaces again. Again, there's limitations on my recording. I had to change positioning because of social distancing rules, whereas in lockdown there were no people, so I could use the same locations or the same spot and record. So I tried to get as close as possible to have the same kind of parallel recordings. And I also didn't have any SPL metering, so I couldn't really have this quantitative data to show what was the difference in the space. Now, I'm not going to play this since there's not a lot of time, but this is one instance of listening to us re-entering lockdown. So on October 16th, the lockdown 2 was starting at 6 o'clock. So I recorded on the 15th of October, and this was an instance where the points, it's a popular bar on the left, you could see it in the image, where people were having kind of last pints. And this is the cleanup, the ending of exit strategies and re-entering lockdown 2. So it's the one instance where we could hear this transition from pre-lockdown into lockdown. Now everything is accessible on my website, so you would be able to hear the parallels between October 15th all the way to October 21st, and hear kind of this difference and re-entering of a lockdown. Now, in terms of how I distributed this information or my audio, a lot of it were towards sound maps. One of them was Pete Stollery's COVID-19 sound map, which is kind of this encapsulated moment of different places in the world of people recording COVID. And now this is accessible online. And one thing that has an advantage of this is that you don't have to physically be in the space to listen to the material. You can just click and see the flag itself and read a bit of the text of what was happening at that time. And you're hearing the relationship change between spaces with the lack of human presence. So it's an understanding of how the nature and urban sound environments are changing or ever changing without humans in those spaces. Another instance was using the Echoes app, which is a sound walking app. And now what this app allows you to be in the physical space, and these little kind of circles or bubbles, once you're entering these spaces, you'll hear the start of an audio. So you'll hear where I actually recorded some of the audio and kind of experience in time what the space sounded like at that particular moment. And so really using sound as documentation. One thing that has lacked with human history is how spaces or events have changed orally. And again, I've sent this out to different platforms. So some of them have been virtual galleries or exhibitions. Other ones have been sound maps, and other ones for user experience like the NI Science Festival from last year. So all these kind of instances are allowing people or users to access this information in different ways, some being in Belfast or Northern Ireland, others being online across the world. So it's really the open access of sharing information and understanding how we can document sound and share it with others. And using sound is quite important because it does retain a lot of information that we perhaps don't consider. So the perspective of ourself in the space and how sound is ever changing with the combination of lack of human presence. So in the urban places here in Belfast, I've been in a lot of the spaces prior to COVID just because of the years living here. So my experience has changed of understanding how these spaces work. New sounds have arose from those spaces during COVID. So I'm paying more attention to how things are interacting with one another. And at the same time, it is a form of documenting COVID. Now, we do have a lot of text, we have video, when we have photographs of COVID happening, but the sound of COVID is something maybe a lot of people haven't considered. And this is one project that kind of reinforces the listening and hearing of our spaces. Since then, I've added a lot more material, so I'm up to 76 instances of the lockdown. I've also added some material from back home when I visited last Christmas. So I have a lot of material, and the third lockdown that happened here as well. There's a lot of creative projects of reusing my soundscape, so understanding how I could use the material in different forms and kind of create new experiences from it. And the next project I'm working on is expanding my research from myself into the reflection of others. So I'm trying to look for participants that are willing to share their experiences through COVID and use some of the material that I haven't made public yet to create these kind of creative works and perhaps an immersive experience so people can experience it in galleries or other venues. Now, all this information is accessible on my website. So if you feel like going later on, here's the website. References if everyone wants to know. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Georgios, for this presentation. Can all of the remaining presenters just sort of, Georgios, stay online. Can all of the remaining presenters please join us on the stage and just very briefly talk a little bit about perhaps the changing relationships or perhaps the transferring of the same kind of discourses and treatments that we've seen in person in the virtual sphere. So thinking about, for example, David and Tessa, you talked a little bit about interacting in the virtual spaces or creating music and composition sort of remotely, and that was in the virtual space. And then Georgios, you talked about changing relationship between humans and environment in the physical space. So is there an element where we perhaps transfer our concerns, our attitudes into the virtual space, not realizing that this is a different space, and whereby we define it as we define a physical space? Do you think that there is a way we can redefine relationships in the virtual space, and perhaps by doing so redefine how we relate to things in the physical space? Is there a certain relationship between that, or do you think that these spaces might be completely different worlds as we treat them as completely different worlds?
Well, I'm just going to jump in there, but yeah, I think there's a misconception. I mean, obviously I'm talking really heavily about my research here, but a misconception that virtual spaces are neutral and aren't imbued with all the kind of cultural, including kind of exclusionary tactics that obviously exist in the real world, that we're becoming real world, not virtual world, that we're becoming more and more aware of. I think there's also a misconception that the virtual world isn't also the real world. So lots of researchers use, in my field anyway, use the term away from keyboard to describe the space that's not the virtual world. But yes, I definitely think that in terms of particularly my research, or thinking about maybe abolitionist practices, it's, in real world, you're having to apply much more of an interventionist strategy, because you are working with existing spaces. Say if you're trying to run a club night in a venue that has previously been a different kind of space, say a courtroom or a police station. There's a venue like that in Bristol. You're having to navigate the preordained ideas imbued in that building. Whereas in the virtual world, you can work from an abolitionist perspective, because you can build an entirely new space and a new way of interacting in it.
Thank you. Anyone else to jump in? Do we find ourselves creating in the same way? Yeah, David.
Yeah, I found that a lot of the ways in which we would have collaborated in person were transferred into this virtual space, but also that a lot of the ways we then performed in the virtual spaces are then transformed back. So we're looking to perform this piece again, but in person this time, and then we can do a direct comparison about what was different in the ways we interacted when we were sharing a room versus when we were 300 miles away from each other.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about encountering narratives or creating music or encountering new environments, do you feel like audiences might actually, not just creators, so not just composers or narrative builders, do you feel like perhaps audiences will relate or encounter some kind of difficulty, some kind of barrier to experience something in a virtual world, as opposed to how they would normally relate to it in a physical world? Yeah, Constantin, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this has like, there are definitely technological constraints in terms of accessibility, not just only that you have access to the headset, but even as a level designer, you make the level in such a way that you can, or by testing, you just use your own body as reference. And this is very dangerous, because then you forget that there are people kind of smaller or taller than you, and then you suddenly end up in worlds where they shouldn't be and stuff like this. So it's actually very important to keep accessibility in mind while creating an experience. Saying that is also quite difficult to, and especially not tying them to specific game mechanics as well. So I do think that it's really worth thinking about accessibility in lots of different ways, especially in VR, but also in real life too.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your presentations and your talks. Just a quick reminder to everyone watching that all of the posters and links to projects are exhibited on the website. And we already have a comment from Lydia saying that they're great, and she's having great fun browsing through them. But yeah, do join us for the rest of the 2 remaining sessions, and thank you very much for your presentations to our lovely speakers. Virtual applause. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.